Welcome to podcast number 2 of our AI-generated news summary. Let's dive into the summaries of our top stories. Our next story is titled, 2024 Campaign. Too much negativity, not enough policy. 79% of registered voters say that the race does not make them feel proud of their country. 71% describe the race as too negative and 62% think that it wasn't enough. 68% of voters think that the presidential campaign has been interesting so far, versus just 30% who think it was dull. Despite these criticisms, there's one thing that most Americans agree on. The campaign was not boring. The presidential election is less than 3 weeks away, with Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump locked in a tight race for the White House. The race is expected to go down to the wire in the final days of the campaign. The final polls are expected to be released on November 8. The election will be held on Tuesday, November 8, at 8 p.m. local time in the U.S. and 9 p.m. ET in the rest of the world. The last presidential election was in 1988, when George H.W. Bush was elected. The current president, Barack Obama, was elected in 2008. Our next story is titled, India plans $109 billion of grid investments to boost renewables. India plans to install 0.0 gigawatts of non-fossil energy capacity by 2030, effectively doubling its current capacity. India's new National Electricity Plan, Transmission, envisages the addition of hundreds of thousands of kilometers of transmission lines. Last month, Renewables Energy Minister Prahlad Joshi said that financial institutions had pledged $386 billion in investment commitments. Reliance committed 100 gigawatts of additional renewable capacity, and Adani Green Energy pledged to develop 38.8 gigawatts of capacity. The government aims to have 500 gigawatts of renewable energy capacity installed by 2030 and more than 600 gigawatts by 2032, according to the Renewables Power Plan, PPP. It is also planning to install more than 1 gigawatt of solar power capacity by the end of the next decade. The PPP says. The PPP is aimed at reducing India's reliance on fossil fuel energy by 50% by the year 2030. It also aims to reduce India's dependence on coal by 50%. Our next story is titled, After locking up 1,000s for weed possession, Kamala Harris patronizes black men in pot pandering scheme. Kamala Harris is on track to post Democrats' worst presidential election performance with blacks in 64 years. She's proposing an opportunity agenda for black men that includes dishing out $1 million forgivable loans at $20,000 each. The loans would be offered to black entrepreneurs. The scheme comes on the heels of Barack Obama scolding brothers for their lackluster support of the vice president. Black men immediately took to social media to ridicule Obama, Harris and the Democratic Party. The campaign opted not to acknowledge that Harris was herself an enthusiastic over-policer, jailed black people in California for smoking weed. Over 1,500 people in jail. The campaign said in a fundraising email to black voters. The pledge comically evidences Harris's generationally terrible poll numbers among blacks. Harris is poised to have the lowest share of the black vote since John F. Kennedy faced Richard Nixon. The proposal comes after Obama tried to shame black voters into voting for him. Our next story is titled, Trump destroys Bloomberg editor-in-chief. Receives standing ovation in Chicago. Former President Donald Trump sat down with Bloomberg editor-in-chief John Micklethwait for an interview. Trump knocked several tough questions out of the park, while starting and ending with a standing ovation. Trump, stupid people made these deals. I saw trade deals that were so stupid that you'd have to be an idiot to sign them. Trump's economic Plan includes a 60% levy on imports from China and 10% duties on the rest of the world. He also refused to be corrected for calling California's Governor Gavin Newsom, Kamala Harris isn't looking so hot on Polymarket. Trump has 57.7% chance, Harris has 41.9% chance. Trump said he thinks the Federal Reserve sets a horrible tone. There are certain companies you have to have, he said. I want a lot of people to come into our country, but I want them to come in legally, Trump said. 425,000 people who are horrible criminals and 13,099 criminals were let in, Trump replied. Our next story is titled, Iranian TV shows Quds Force Chief after deemed missing for 2 weeks. IRGC Quds Force Commander Brigadier General Esmail Khani was seen in an IRIB live broadcasting, along with other officials. He appeared Tuesday at the funeral, clad in the IRGC's green military uniform. Iran has remained defiant in the face of an expected Israeli retaliation. Tehran has in response said that it desires de-escalation and peace. The funeral was held for General Abbas Nilforushan, who had been killed in the same Israeli airstrike on Beirut. The Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi. We are prepared for war, but also for peace. The funeral took place in Tehran, Iran's capital, and was broadcast live on state TV. It was the first time he had been seen in public for 2 weeks. Some Western reports had speculated that he had suffered a heart attack or that his health was deteriorating, but he looks healthy in the newly released footage. He was seen wearing a military uniform, as well as his IRGC's green uniform. Our next story is titled, Georgia Judge Rules County Officials Can't Decline to Certify Election Results. Julie Adams is a Republican member of the Fulton County Board of Elections and Registrations. She brought the lawsuit after the county's appointed election director allegedly denied her repeated requests for access to election results and processes. Georgia law requires county election superintendents to certify election results by 5 p.m. on the Monday following the election. Fulton County Superior Court Judge Robert McBurney ruled on October 14 that election officials must stick to that deadline. He reasoned that allowing election superintendent to play investigator, prosecutor, jury, and judge would effectively silence voters. He ruled that election certification is a purely ministerial task. The lawsuit was settled out of court on October 14, and Adams was awarded $1,000. The case is still under appeal and is expected to be heard by a federal judge in the coming weeks. According to the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, it is the first of its kind in the state of Georgia and the second in the United States. Our next story is titled, Trump Pulls Ahead in Battleground States. As of October 14, 2024, polling averages aggregated by website RealClear Polling show that Republican candidate Donald Trump has caught up in battleground states. Democratic contender Kamala Harris led her opponent by 0.3 percentage points only in the state of Wisconsin most recently. Harris has 215 votes, including 76 likely, leaning ones, while Trump has 219 votes. Harris would have to carry slightly more of battleground votes to reach an electoral college majority. Our next story is titled, Israel's supply of interceptor missiles under strain amid daily assaults. Israel's anti-air defense systems have been regularly engaging inbound threats, sometimes expending hundreds of interceptors a day. Israel has long relied on the United States to supply it with heavy artillery, bombs, and missiles, but now appears to be running low on interceptors. The U.S. announced on Sunday the deployment of a Terminal High Altitude Area Defense (THAAD) anti-missile battery. Will the U.S. ever cut off Israel? It is unlikely. Given that both sides of the aisle tend to be led by Israel firsters and support Israel's right-wing government, the Israeli military, relying on the U.S. to fill the gaps in protective shields the U.S. has now sent the Army's THAAD missile defense system. It is expected that the U.S. will continue to provide ironclad support for Israel until at least the end of the next presidential election in 2016. The U.S. is expected to provide Israel with a strong military presence in the Middle East. Our next story is titled, Monkeypox. Evidence of the pandemic preparedness lie. In 2003, 35 people in 6 U.S. states were confirmed to have been infected with the clade 2 type of the monkeypox virus. This outbreak was an odd, self-limited, and entirely incidental occurrence. In a sensible and ethical world, these findings might have shut the door on ill-advised research on monkeypox. We must put an end to all gain-of-function research and to the bogus pandemic preparedness excuse for illegal bioweapons research, writes Peter Bergen. The only plausible cure for monkeypox madness is a cure for pandemics, says Bergen. And the only plausible way to prevent them is to stop all research into superbugs in the first place. He says, the best way to stop superbugs is by stopping all research at all. Writes Bergen. One does not save Tokyo by creating Godzilla. This grand deception has worked for decades. And in truth, there is no legitimate reason to create superbug in the laboratory. Our next story is titled, IEA sees sizable surplus in oil market as demand growth slows. The oil market faces a sizable surplus next year amid ample supply and slowing demand growth. Global oil demand is set to increase by just 862,000 barrels per day. BPD. This year, the United States, Brazil, Guyana, and Canada are set to account for most of the increase. This will more than cover expected demand growth, the IEA says. The IEA affirmed it is ready to act in case of supply shocks. OPEC cut its oil demand growth outlook for a third consecutive month, due to actual consumption data so far this year and expectations of slightly lower demand in some regions. The agency said it was prepared to act if needed in the event of a supply shock, such as a fall in demand for crude oil in the Middle East or an increase in oil prices in the U.S. and elsewhere in the world. It said it is prepared to take action in the case of a drop in demand, as well as a rise in prices. That concludes our AI-generated news summary for today. Thanks for listening, and stay tuned for our next episode.